Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. They haven't stopped since the horror began 3 weeks ago. Tyler's face from that last dinner, laughing at something absurd Kevin said about the buffet shrimp, comes to mind every time I close my eyes. At the time, I was a 26-year-old junior accountant sharing a small living in a Chicago apartment with 3 men who had been my best friends since college. For nearly 2 years, we had been accumulating money, asking for time off work, and all the other things in preparation for this Caribbean trip. Before 2 of us went away for new work, it was meant to be our big celebratory vacation. Josh, Tyler, Kevin, and I had reserved adjacent rooms on the Coral Princess's 7th deck. Josh used his camera to record everything. Kevin kept us grounded with his practical jokes, and Tyler was the one who was always pushing us to try new things. This cruise seemed like the ideal way to close up the chapter of our life that we had been friends with since our freshman year. It was a huge ship, one of those floating cities with lots of restaurants, entertainment places, and swimming pools. For the first 2 days, we simply explored and tried various bars, and deciding which port excursions to reserve, Tyler got up really early to see the sunrise from the upper deck, which was a strange hobby of his. With his coffee and the battered journal he took with him everywhere, he had been doing it since day one. Whether it was taking pictures of the beach or jotting down weird musings about life, the man was concerned with capturing the ideal moments. Around 5 a.m. on the 3rd morning, he reported witnessing some crew members engaging in heated discussions close to the restricted zones. At breakfast, he made a joke about it, stating that it appeared they were talking about something important rather than simply standard ship business. Tyler kept bringing it up throughout the day, asking if we had seen anything odd about various employees, but we shrugged it off. It was that night when things began to feel different. Tyler appeared more perceptive than normal during our meal at the main restaurant, pointing out crew members he had seen on his morning walks and continuously scanning the dining area. He began to record of their shift adjustments and rotations, which we assumed was simply his analytical mind growing disinterested. He whispered, leaning in close during dessert, that he had heard 2 cleaning staff members discussing another one in quick Spanish. However, they quickly changed the topic and turned to English when they saw he was listening. We all stopped talking when he described their response to the abrupt stillness, the anxious looks, and the hasty departure. After attending the late-night comedy show and spending the remainder of the night at the casino, we returned to our rooms at around 1 in the morning. As usual, we said each other good night through the adjacent door. Tyler was in room 7142, which was just next to me. For perhaps 20 minutes, I could hear him moving around, pulling drawers, running water, the regimen for going to bed. His TV switching to a late-night chat show was the last thing I heard, which wasn't strange because he frequently dozed off with it on. That night, the water was especially choppy, and the ship's shaking actually accelerated my sleep. At 6:47 a.m., the hammering on my door began. I looked at the digital clock, dazed and disoriented, wondering why cleaning would be so combative at such an early hour, yet I know the precise time. It wasn't housekeeping, though. Josh and Kevin were there, talking over each other and appearing to be in a hurry. In order to surprise Tyler with coffee and pastries from the breakfast buffet, they had gone to his room. However, he was absent. He had not yet made his bed, fresh writing from the previous evening was in his journal, which was open on the desk. Additionally, the drapes were whipping and his balcony door was wide open, in the early wind. He still had his coffee maker, ready for his typical 5 a.m. The timer never went off, but it was routine. After calling ship security right away, crew members began to fill our hallway in a matter of minutes. Our statements were taken, with what appeared to be practiced speed, by Captain Martinez, the stern woman in charge of security. She inquired about Tyler's mental health, including whether he had been drinking excessively and whether he had a history of depression or sleepwalking. It seemed as though she had practiced her queries a lot. Her attitude changed a little when we brought up Tyler's insights on crew talks and his propensity to explore restricted places. As she grew increasingly official, she informed us that travelers occasionally misunderstand procedure, operational talks, and that Tyler's early morning routine had probably resulted in a sad mishap. 2 hours later, the ship was announced. There was a minute of quiet after a sobering announcement about a passenger who had gone overboard during the night. Here's what troubled me, though. In reality, they never conducted a complete search of the ship. No methodical room-by-room inspection. There was no notice asking other travelers if they had noticed anything out of the ordinary. Rather, they immediately went into their overboard protocol, using binoculars to survey the ocean surface and calling the Coast Guard. Captain Martinez clarified that the deck cameras had been undergoing maintenance when Josh proposed that they see the security footage from those cameras. The time appeared to be impossible, and she gave her explanation too swiftly, like if she had already planned it. The three of us were sitting in the main room that afternoon, trying to figure out what had happened, when we heard a conversation that confirmed our suspicions. A maintenance worker, to crew members, and an individual from at a nearby table. Guest services were conversing softly, perhaps thinking we couldn't hear them over the background noise. The maintenance man talked about the third one this season, and how they needed to choose their applicants more carefully. The woman in charge of guest services hushed him, reminded him right once that management is in charge of the paperwork, and that their only responsibility was to keep the schedule in place. They quickly stopped talking and started walking away in different directions. When they realized we were listening, the remainder of the day was spent discreetly looking into it, chatting with other travelers, and inquiring casually whether they had seen anything out of the ordinary. Around 2 a.m., an elderly couple from Texas informed us that they had overheard a fight on the deck above them. However, they only saw crew members cleaning equipment when they peered out their balcony. One woman who was traveling alone reported that the previous evening, she had seen someone being escorted through the service hallways, but she had assumed that it was simply a drunken traveler being assisted to their room. Each tale we heard depicted a scene of late-night activities that were inconsistent with the regular operations of cruise ships. When we followed up with the crew guarding their protocols and procedures, their explanations got more and more erratic. Our final night on board the cruise was the tipping point. Josh had been recording everything on his phone, including pictures, notes, and chats, and he intended to get in touch with the police when we got to port. Approximately 11 p.m. someone knocked on his door. Two crew members said they had to check his room and reported maintenance problems when he opened it. When Josh declined, they presented him an official-looking document concerning required safety checks. They were kind, but persistent. His phone unexpectedly vanished from his nightstand as they were inspecting his room. After 20 minutes, the crew members departed after finding nothing amiss, but Josh's evidence was gone. Later, Captain Martinez clarified that phones can occasionally get lost during harsh waters and volunteered to assist him in submitting a claim for missing property. Knowing that we would never truly know what had happened to Tyler, we disembarked the following morning feeling both sad and frustrated. 2 weeks later, the cruise line issued us an official letter of condolence, explaining that their inquiry had found Tyler had gone overboard while going about his morning routine. In addition to asking us to sign a statement admitting their extensive research, They enclosed a tiny reimbursement check. We didn't sign it. Rather, Kevin located a marine attorney who focuses on cruise ship mishaps, and we discovered that Tyler wasn't the first traveler to vanish from that specific vessel. Over the previous 3 years, there had been at least 6 instances like this, all determined to be unintentional, involving travelers who had been inquiring or investigating forbidden regions. The cruise line has strong legal staff, and the majority of mishaps occur in international waters where jurisdiction becomes complex, but the lawyer is still assembling a case. Every day, I'm worrying if Tyler found something that would have made him hazardous to their organization, and if the truth about what actually happened that night will ever be revealed. I will always be haunted by what transpired on that cruise ship. I'm a 34-year-old Denver accountant who reserved a spot on the Ocean Majesty for a leisurely week in the Caribbean last September. I had finally received the promotion I had been pursuing after working 60-hour weeks for 2 years at my company, and during my yearly visit, the doctor had begun to make scathing remarks about how stressed I was. The vacation appeared to be the ideal cure. 7 days of no spreadsheets at all, poolside relaxation, and limitless food. Although I had never taken a cruise before, the brochure presented it as a floating paradise with plenty of entertainment options, numerous dining options, and enormous pools. My expectations were fulfilled during the first 3 days. Deck 7 was where I spent my mornings, with a novel in paperback, wandering the ship's infinite hallways in the afternoons and dining at various restaurants in the nights. The splendor of the ocean resembled a floating metropolis. Almost 4,000 travelers, as well as crews with seemingly endless decks. I became friends with Janet and Robert, a retired couple from Portland who had taken numerous cruises and were always pointing me the best places on the ship, 3 tables away in the dining area. Janet's contagious laugh could be heard. Additionally, Robert consistently donned these absurd Hawaiian shirts that somehow made him appear distinguished. We had made it a habit to get together for breakfast every morning at the Serenity Deck restaurant, which had great coffee and breathtaking views of the ocean. However, on Wednesday, the 4th morning, everything changed. Around 6:30 a.m. I woke up to this strange feeling. It was a different ship. It was more irregular, almost jerky, than the soft rocking motion I had grown accustomed to. Additionally, the engines had a distinct sound, as if they were exerting more effort than normal. Perhaps we were experiencing some severe weather. I reasoned, however. The ocean appeared to be rather quiet as I drew back the curtains on my balcony door. I could make out a number of other ships in the distance as the rising sun cast this lovely golden path across the ocean. It was surprising considering that we had been largely alone on the open sea for the previous 3 days, assuming Janet and Robert would have some explanation for the ship's peculiar conduct. I changed and went to join them for breakfast. When I got to the eatery, the ambience was nervous. There were no loud voices, and I saw a number of crew members clustered close to the coffee station, whispering urgently to each other, already seated at our customary table. Janet and Robert appeared concerned, rather than their normal upbeat morning chatter. Robert's face was pale under his vacation tan, but his Hawaiian shirt was a vibrant orange with pom-poms. Janet wasn't even laughing. She was looking out the window at those far-off ships, while holding her coffee cup in both hands. She leaned over and whispered that she had heard some unsettling tales from other passengers as soon as I sat down. Some of the crew members appeared to be genuinely worried about our destination, and it seemed that some were claiming that the ship had taken an unexpected course throughout the night. Around 9:00 a.m., Captain Harrison's voice sounded on the ship's intercom. Typically, he used this deep, commanding voice to announce dinner reservations and entertainment schedules. He sounded stressed this time, though. He declared that all passengers had to go back to their cabins immediately and stay there until further notice because of navigational changes. No justification, no time estimate. It was a straightforward command that chilled the whole dining room. The crew members, who had been whispering, abruptly jumped into action, guiding passengers toward the elevators in a kind but strong manner. I observed families with small children gathering their possessions, their faces displaying fear and bewilderment. When a young girl, perhaps 6 years old, repeatedly asked her mother why they couldn't go to the pool, her mother just said, "Soon, sweetheart," in a tone that didn't seem to be persuaded. The stroll back to my it felt like a funeral march in the cabin. After 3 days of joy and laughing, the ship's halls were suddenly eerily quiet save for the sound of footfall and anxious murmurs. On my way to the elevator, I passed the main deck and noticed something that made my chest constrict. The ships in the distance were neither commercial nor recreational. They were approaching, and they were military ships. I saw uniformed figures moving on their decks, and their grey hulls sliced purposefully across the sea. What appeared to be mounted equipment glinted in the morning sun. Gear that was very clearly not for transporting or fishing. I frantically hit the elevator button many times in an attempt to get to my cabin and try to figure out what was going on. As soon as my cabin was secured, I ran straight to my balcony and looked through the glass door. My pulse was pounding since I could now see details of the military ships up close. At least 4 ships surrounded us in what appeared to be a perimeter, and each one was flying a crimson flag with an unidentifiable symbol that was difficult to read from a distance. I saw armed soldiers moving about on the deck of the largest ship, which had what looked like a helicopter landing pad. I could hear other travelers speaking in quiet, terrified tones through the walls of my cabin. I could hear a man's voice attempting to console the woman who was crying in the cabin next to mine. We were now hardly moving at all, and the ship's engines had nearly stopped. Drifting beside these military ships that kept their positions around us as if we were a valuable asset they were protecting. Around 11 a.m., the intercom crackled once more. However, it wasn't Captain Harrison this time. Through the speakers came a voice I didn't know, speaking with a foreign accent. His comments chilled me to the bone. He introduced himself as Commander Valdez of the Maritime Defense Force. He declared that the Ocean Majesty was currently being escorted by the military to entering restricted territorial seas without permission. While the matter was being handled diplomatically, all passengers were to stay in their cabins. His words resolved made we sounded more like cargo than individuals. There was a spooky silence over the ship when the announcement was over. Even the typical water sounds sounded muffled, as if everyone was holding their breath, anticipating what would come next. Without any developments, the hours passed slowly. The line was busy when I attempted to phone the main desk. I tried to connect to my family using the ship's Wi-Fi, but the internet was down. I could see the military ships standing their ground, never more than a few hundred yards away, via the door of my balcony. Approximately 2 p.m., overhead, I could hear multiple helicopters, their rotors making a loud boom that shook the ship as a whole. As I put my face against the glass, I noticed them flying like mechanical vultures over us. Compared to the others, one helicopter was significantly larger, and I could see uniformed on the upper deck of our ship, figures are rappelling down ropes. It was all horrifyingly true when we saw armed soldiers actually boarding our ship. This was not a simple miscommunication that could be resolved over the phone. We were indeed caught in the midst of a global crisis. The uncertainty was the worst. Neither the nature of the situation or its duration was known. The old couple across the hall from me was arguing angrily over whether or not to try to leave their cabin, and I could hear children sobbing in other cabins, while his wife pleaded with him that he would do anything that might worsen the situation. The guy persisted in claiming they had rights as citizens of the United States. 4:00 p.m. I heard footsteps coming from the hallway. The typical crew wore soft, cheap shoes, but these were heavy boots. Someone's door was knocked on sharply, and then there was a muffled conversation in what sounded like Spanish. Next, One more knock nearer my chamber. I could feel the thumping of my heart in my throat. I was petrified when the knock on my door arrived, terrified to answer, but also terrified of the consequences if I didn't. When I opened the door, I saw a young woman called Lisa, who had been serving drinks at the pool bar just the day before, standing in the corridor with a uniformed soldier. Lisa's normally cheerful smile had been replaced by barely controlled panic, and she looked scared. The soldier was using a list to compare room numbers, and he requested my identity in English with a strong accent. His gear appeared serious and operational, and his uniform was clean and military specific, with patches I didn't identify. He looked at my passport, then just nodded and went to the next door. Lisa briefly drew my attention, and before they moved on down the hallway, I saw her utter the word sorry. In some way, that little encounter gave everything greater substance. Seeing a person had laughed with a few days before turned into a scared tour guide for international military personnel. Approximately 7:00 p.m. when Captain Harrison's voice came back over the intercom, he sounded entirely different. Something that verged on defeat took the place of his customary tone of confidence. The ship had indeed entered disputed territorial waters, he declared. Waters because of navigational errors, he said, adding that diplomatic talks were still in progress. He reassured us that we should maintain our composure and patience, since our safety came first. Then he spoke something that numbingly affected every part of my body. According to him, the ship's initial course had been changed to maximize fuel economy, and that this choice had resulted in our current situation. As the ramifications of his remarks became clear to me, I understood that someone had deliberately chosen to bypass restricted waterways in order to save money, and 4,000 individuals now were bearing the consequences. Armed troops patrolled our decks, and military warships held their positions throughout the night as the standoff continued. After what I later found out were lengthy diplomatic conversations, we were freed the following morning. However, the cruise line discreetly resolved lawsuits and, within weeks, dismissed Captain Harrison. I'll never forget the sensation of being utterly helpless in the middle of the ocean, caught between global politics and corporate avarice, even though I never found out exactly which country's seas we had invaded. I traveled frequently as a pharmaceutical sales representative, but the Mediterranean trip was planned to be unique. This was my first actual vacation in 3 years. At the age of 28, I felt as though I had been living out of hotel rooms throughout the Midwest and completing transactions for months. The trip was a present on my own birthday. 7 days of total detachment from conference calls and spreadsheets. The celestial horizon was my first choice because of its stellar reputation for exquisite dining and opulent amenities. With almost 4,000 passengers, the ship was enormous. Nevertheless, with its marble lobbies and crystal chandeliers that reflected the Mediterranean sunlight in dazzling prisms, it nevertheless felt personal. On our 3rd day at sea, immediately following our departed from Barcelona's port, on deck 12, I had been anticipating supper at the ship's most upscale eatery, Palazzo Nero. I had to pay an additional $200 for the reservation, but the reviews said the food would be amazing. I was placed at a corner table overlooking the infinite ocean by the maitre, a tall man with silver hair and an Italian accent. The atmosphere was ideal, candles burning on white tablecloths, soft jazz music, and the ship's soft sway, which produces a cadence that is almost hypnotic. I believed the Sumaya's advice and ordered the chef's tasting menu, which included 7 meals matched with wines I had never heard of. From the amuse-bouche to the last dessert, a delicate panna cotta that looked perfect, everything appeared to be perfect, like silk. It melted on my tongue. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning when the first indicators appeared. I woke up with a mild headache, a nauseous feeling in my stomach, and what I initially believed to be motion sickness. However, as I laid in my cabin, I became aware that something was different as I heard the ship's engines humming below me. I had to cuddle up in my small bed because of the painful pains that accompanied the waves of nausea. I had previously been on cruise ships, but I had never had seasickness this bad. A cold perspiration appeared on my brow, and the chamber seemed to be spinning faster than the ship's normal motion. My stomach emptied rapidly as I staggered to the restroom, nearly making it. It tasted sour and metallic, nothing like the fine lunch I had eaten hours before. In between retching, I could hear muffled moans, similar noises from nearby cabins, and the distinct sound of other people being ill. The ship's medical area was overcrowded by dawn. A line of pale, trembling individuals stretched down the corridor as I made my way to deck 5, having managed to get clothed. The ship's physician, a middle-aged woman with gentle eyes and a look of obvious worrying on her face, was rushing between patients. I heard her discussing the very high volume of patients they were seeing in a whispered conversation with a nurse. Almost overnight, 60 passengers reported identical symptoms. The pattern was what I found strange. The night before, everyone who had become unwell had eaten at Palazzo Naro. The ship's other dining options, the buffet, even the informal pizza place, or even the steakhouse, their customers appeared to be doing just well. I watched as more people, some so frail they required assistance walking, staggered in as I waited for almost 2 hours. The personnel repeatedly assured us that it was simply a stomach ailment, which is common on cruise ships. However, their apprehensive looks and whispered chatter indicated they were aware that this was anything but typical. Over the course of the following day, things quickly got worse. What had begun as a serious case of food sickness soon turned into something much darker. After their health worsened, 3 passengers, a young mother traveling with her teenage daughter, and an elderly couple from Ohio, were transferred to the ship's intensive care unit. They were experiencing more than just gastroenteritis. They were suffering from neurological issues, irregular heartbeats, and extreme dehydration, as the medical team discreetly explained. Amanda told me this information, one of the nurses I had gotten to know during my regular trips to the medical bay. She had been with the cruise line for 8 years, working the night shift, and was able to recognize when anything was really amiss. She drew me away during one of our chats and whispered that the blood tests revealed abnormally high amounts of toxins, something she had never observed before. In common occurrences of food poisoning, on the 4th day, the ship's captain finally spoke to the passengers, his voice piercing the intercom system with hardly disguised tension. He declared that the rare event at Palazzo Nero was being thoroughly investigated, and that all impacted guests will receive full medical attention as well as payment. But as I glanced around the ship and noticed the increasing number of locked cabin doors and vacant deck seats, his comments seemed hollow. Everything about the atmosphere had changed. It felt like a jail now, when there had been a floating paradise. Unaffected passengers murmured among themselves in small clusters, glancing suspiciously at passing crewmen. Most individuals were too scared to eat anything other than sealed food they had brought from home, so the dining halls were half empty. I observed that there was more security on board the ship. Guards were positioned at the gates to previously open but restricted locations. The way the personnel behaved had also altered. When they believed that passengers were not paying attention, they spoke in low voices and avoided making eye contact, moving with jittery efficiency. On the 5th day, there was a breakthrough that wasn't related to the official investigation. I heard a furious argument by 2 cleaning staff members while I was seated in the library, one of the ship's few remaining peaceful areas. Although they were chatting quickly in Spanish, I was able to understand snippets of their conversation because to my undergraduate coursework. They spoke of Venza's and Carlos' retaliation. One of them repeatedly shook her head, stating that they had alerted management to his actions months earlier, long time ago. They left as soon as they realized I was listening, but not before I heard their name, Carlos Mendoza, a sous chef who had been working in the kitchen of Palazzo Nero. Later, Amanda verified my suspicions. Carlos has received numerous reprimands for his behavior toward both management and passengers. Just weeks before our vacation, he had apparently been passed up for a promotion to head chef, a role that went to someone with more people skills, but less experience. The parts started to fit together with a startling clarity. During that Tuesday evening service, Carlos had deliberately tainted some dishes, focusing on the priciest menu items that were exclusively ordered by Palazzo Nero patrons who paid. However, what was even more unsettling about this was the accuracy required. He had miraculously avoided poisoning other crew members or diners from other restaurants, indicating that this was a planned attack rather than an angry outburst. Amanda informed me that they had discovered remnants of an industrial cleaning solvent combined with a typical culinary item, something that would seriously harm the insides while masking the taste. The insight struck me like a blow to the body. We had more than simply food poisoning. We were victims of one man's perverse quest for retribution against the crew's business. Knowing that Carlos was still on board, still cooking, still pacing the halls as passengers suffered as a result of his willful activities, was the worst part. After I came to terms with the reality, my paranoia became oppressive. Each crew member turned into a possible danger. Each meal is a potential weapon. I began to notice things that I had never noticed before. The manner some employees avoided making eye contact. How certain people appeared to know more than they were disclosing. The little conflicts that exist between various departments. Through the glass barrier, I observed the kitchen crew during dinner service, observing their motions and speculating about the possible involvement of others. Were there other workers who weren't happy? Was this a component of a wider plot, or had Carlos acted alone? I was so preoccupied with the questions that I was unable to unwind or take enjoyment in the little things in life. I started stockpiling food from the gift store that I could be sure were in sealed packaging. I struggled to fall asleep as I laid in my cabin, paying attention to every footfall in the hallway, and worrying that someone may mess with the ventilation system, put something beneath my door. Once a floating palace, the ship now seemed like a labyrinth of possible threats. Day 6 was the pivotal moment when I saw something that validated my worst suspicions. Around midnight, unable to sleep, I was strolling by the crew quarters in the hopes that the night air on deck would help me relax. I caught Carlos chatting animatedly with two other staff members I didn't recognize through a partially open door. I was so cold because of the contented look on his face. It was the face of someone who had done exactly what he had set out to achieve, not of someone who had made a horrible mistake. I heard bits of Spanish mixed with English. He gestured toward the passenger areas and the higher decks. He said something about showing them what happens when you don't respect us and teaching them a lesson. The other crew members became uneasy. One of them backed up from the chat and shook his head. But Carlos kept talking, his voice becoming more enthusiastic and self-satisfied. That's when I understood he had absolutely no regret. He felt pleased of himself for having successfully retaliated against the cruise line and its passengers. The loneliness of being stranded at sea made things more difficult, even though I knew I had to take action. The following morning, I went up to Amanda, along with all I'd heard and seen. She confirmed that Carlos had been assigned to run the kitchen during our disastrous dinner service, while she listened in increasing dread. We all agreed to get around the ship's security, who might be corrupted or just inept, and make immediate touch with the authorities. Amanda assisted me in calling the Coast Guard using the ship's satellite communication system, giving them comprehensive details regarding Carlos's identification, his motivation, and the proof we had collected. It was a prompt and decisive answer. Our ship was captured by a Coast Guard cutter within hours, and federal agents boarded to apprehend Carlos. Most passengers were unaware that the arrest was taking place because it happened so swiftly. They merely noticed more security guards navigating the ship with efficiency and purpose. After Carlos was taken into custody, the matter was resolved quickly. He admitted to purposefully poisoning the meals with industrial cleaning chemicals after being confronted with overwhelming evidence and the testimonies of other crew members who had previously been reluctant to speak up. According to the inquiry, he had been preparing this attack for weeks, carefully researching the restaurant's protocols and timing his activities to inflict the most damage. We received appropriate care for the chemical poisoning, and all impacted passengers were promptly evacuated to a medical center in Naples. The cruise line eventually declared bankruptcy after being the target of numerous lawsuits. More significantly, though, Carlos was found guilty of bioterrorism and attempted murder and given a 15-year sentence in federal prison. I fully recovered following a few weeks of therapy. The experience taught me that evil may lurk behind the most commonplace appearances, and that often the greatest risk comes from people who believe they have nothing left to lose. Even though I will never be able to enjoy exquisite dining in the same way again, I still look for seals on my food packaging today and steer clear of dining at establishments where the kitchen is hidden from view. Even when justice is done, some worries never go away. Although it wasn't exactly my ideal employment, working the night shift as a pool deck supervisor on the Celestial Voyager was sufficient to support me while I completed my degree in marine biology. 2019 spring has been a long one. Cruise season is in full gear, with youngsters yelling during the day and an unsettling quiet that descends on the pool decks after dusk. When no one was looking, I would occasionally steal a snack from the passenger buffets and eat any leftovers I could find in the crew mess hall while bunking in a small crew quarter on Deck 3. I was 22 years old. Under the dim deck lights, I would mostly spend my shift reading textbooks. Occasionally, I would patrol the perimeter to look for any passengers attempting to sneak in for a midnight swim or any equipment problems. After 11 p.m., all access to the pool areas was prohibited. That was made very obvious by ship policy, particularly while we were at sea. The isolation was what made the work tolerable. In the peaceful hours between midnight and 6 in the morning, I was the only one. In the aquatic complex, the Olympic-sized lap pool, which was set aside for serious swimmers and morning water aerobics courses, the main pool, the cat splash area, and the hot tubs. After navigating the turmoil of families, the quiet was nearly restorative. Passengers who were intoxicated all day, on a deck chair by the main pool, I would set up my small command center. There was a thermos of coffee that would keep me going all night, and textbooks arranged on a little table. The only noises were the soft far below. There was the faint woo of water from the filtering systems, the buzz of the ship's engines, and the occasional creak of the hull. It was quiet, steady, and just what I needed to concentrate on my studies and make a respectable living during the cruise season. Everything was altered on a late July, Wednesday night. By then, I'd been working there for approximately 3 months, and had been accustomed to showing there around 11:45 p.m. completing my preliminary safety check, after which I start working on my assignments. The pool deck retained the warmth of the day long after the sun had set, and the weather had been ideal that week. I recall the pool lights illuminating the water surface with their recognizable blue hue. I settled into my chair with my organic chemistry textbook. That day had been quite busy on the ship. After extensive use, maintenance had to make adjustments, as evidenced by the strewn pool toys and the somewhat higher chlorine levels. Now, however, it is almost 1 a.m. Like every other night, the place was entirely empty. When I heard it, I was in the middle of a chapter on molecular structures. A noticeable splash coming from the lap pool's direction. Like a dagger through silence, the sound sliced through the ship's engine's steady beat. I initially assumed that the ship's mild rocking motion was the cause of one of the robotic pool cleaners striking the pool wall a bit more forcefully than usual. The maintenance staff had to continually modify their programming to take into consideration the ship's movement and prevent those objects from being trapped in corners or creating excessive noise, because sometimes they had a mind of their own. I then heard it once more, followed by a sound that was definitely someone gasping for air. The noise made me shiver, spine, because the breathing that reverberated off the metal walls and ceiling of the enclosed pool area was so obviously human. Urgent and panicked, I grabbed my flashlight from the equipment bag, closed my textbook, and got to my feet. About 50 yards distant, partially concealed by a beautiful wall of faux palm trees and tropical vegetation, was the lap pool. Plants, I screamed out the usual warning that the pool was closed as I approached the sound, my deck shoes squeaking a little on the damp non-slip surface. There was no answer, only the ongoing splashing and those terrible gasping noises that seemed to reverberate off the ship's hull. As I rounded the bend and my heart almost stopped as I shone my torch at the lap pool, there was nothing in the water. There was no pool cleaner running, no one in the area, and nothing to explain the sounds I could clearly hear. However, despite the ship's steady course over calm seas, the water itself was moving, strong ripples spreading across the surface like someone thrashing around in the deep end. The gasping sounds seemed to be coming from right above the churning water, and they were louder now, more desperate. For what seemed like an eternity, I stood there looking behind the starting blocks, studying the pool deck for any indication of an intruder, and sweeping my flashlight beam across every inch of the pool. After about another half hour, the noises ceased suddenly, and the lake returned to its typical, mirror-like stillness. The ensuing hush was deafening. It appeared as though the entire ship was holding its breath, including the normal hum of the engines. Over the course of the following hour, I thoroughly searched the whole pool complex, looking in every maintenance room, every potential hiding place, and every corner where someone might have hidden. I even reported a potential trespasser to ship security. However, by the time Officer Brennan showed up, I had nothing to show him save my own paranoia. He accompanied me on a perimeter walk, inspected the secured access doors, and verified that every security camera was operational. Later, the video from that night would show me chatting to nothing while wandering around with my flashlight pointed at an empty pool. Brennan handled it well, but when he implied that I might have heard, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Perhaps the ship's hull shifting in the waves, or perhaps sounds from the lower deck pools. But I was aware of what I had heard. It was obviously out of the ordinary and emanated from our lap pool. Ship noises or my imagination couldn't account for the sound. It was too real, too frantic, and too human. I couldn't get those desperate gasping sounds out of my head, but the next few nights went by without any problems. I saw that I was looking at the lap pool all the time and jumping at every creak of the ship's hull it sliced through the waves, every tiny sound the filtering system emitted. I made an effort to tell myself it was simply finals week stress, perhaps too much coffee, but I knew better in my heart. Then, during our shift change around a week later, I was speaking with Nancy, one of the day shift supervisors, having worked on cruise ships for nearly 15 years. She was an experienced worker who was well versed in the fleet's history and rumours. When I mentioned in passing that her expression entirely altered to one of the strange noises I'd been hearing at night, she pulled me away by the equipment storage area after checking to make sure no one else was listening. It was then that she told me about the events of a crossing that took place in the spring of 2017. Something that has been wiped out of the official documents. In what should have been a light-hearted hazing ceremony, two young men, both college students on their first contract on the ship, had perished in that same lap pool. Their names were to 19-year-olds from small Midwest towns named Benjamin and Nathan, had never worked on a cruise ship before. Nancy claims that one night on a sea day, some off-duty crew members decided to start the new guys out with a bizarre swimming challenge after drinking too much. They had supposedly tied weights to the boys' ankles and made them swim laps, while the others timed them and cheered them on from the pool deck, but the specifics were unclear. When Benjamin and Nathan both slipped under and never came back up, what had begun as harmless fun turned fatal. The additional members of the crew were too inebriated and in a panic to successfully mount a rescue. It was also too late by the time they succeeded in removing the bodies. In order to ensure that the incident never made it into any official report or news coverage, the cruise line's legal staff acted quickly, paying off families and threatening litigation. As she concluded the story, NY's voice was hardly audible, above a whisper, and her eyes darted around anxiously, as if she was waiting for a management representative to show there and stop her. She informed me that a number of crew members had resigned right away following the incident, because they couldn't bear the guilt and subsequent cover-up. The directly engaged staff members had been quietly let go with large severance payouts and non-disclosure agreements, all reassigned to other ships. Nancy felt that the next port stop had been more about removing evidence than keeping the pool clean, but even the pool itself had been thoroughly drained, cleaned, and replaced with fresh water. The fact that Nathan and Benjamin had both been proficient swimmers was what plagued her the most. Nathan had been a lifeguard at a neighborhood pool back home, and Benjamin had been on the swim team in high school. The drowning was not a common occurrence for them. However, in the confines of that ship's pool, the mix of weighted restrictions, drink, and peer pressure had produced a perfect storm of catastrophe. The sounds I had been hearing had a whole new meaning, hearing that story, waiting for those frantic gasping sounds to return made every night shift an exercise in controlled horror, and they always came back at the same time, from the lap pool, and they always stayed silent for just long enough to make my skin crawl. I began recording everything that could assist me make sense of what was happening, including the precise times, the length of the sounds, the location of the ship, and the weather. The consistency of the pattern was uncanny. Around 12:45 in the morning, the noises would start. They always begin with splashing and progress to those awful gasping noises, lasting roughly 2 to 3 minutes. I even attempted to record them using my phone, but the audio files were utterly silent, capturing only my own anxious breathing and the background roar of the ship's engines. Whatever was going on seemed to exist in a realm beyond the reach of technology. A sweltering Friday night in early August was the tipping point. I was beginning to doubt my sanity because the noises had been increasing in frequency, sometimes occurring twice in a single shift. We were cruising through calm waters between ports that night, and I made the decision to set up shop next to the lap pool before the regular hour. I positioned a chair at the edge of the pool, prepared my flashlight, and waited, determined to see what was actually happening. At 12:47 a.m., the gasping sounds started as soon as the water in the deep end started to swirl violently. This time, however, I could almost make out words because they were so obvious and frantic. It seemed as though someone was trying to cry out for assistance, but was having trouble breathing. They sounded like they were suffocating on water that didn't exist. The insight struck me like a blow to the body. I could hear the last moments of Nathan and Benjamin replayed over and over in an interminable cycle. I started crying because the dread in those screams was so genuine and unadulterated, not out of fear, but rather from the deep sorrow of two young lives cut short by brutality and ignorance. That's when I decided what to do. I couldn't allow this to go on. Not for whatever remained of Nathan and Benjamin, and not for my own mental health when we got in port the following day. I did as much research as I could on the two victims, finding the social media accounts and local newspapers their relatives had left as a tribute. I made copies of their pictures at an internet cafe and acknowledged that their deaths had not been forgotten and wrote a brief message of apology for what had happened to them. I put the message and pictures on the pool deck by the deep end. That evening, along with 2 little bouquets of flowers I had been able to purchase from a vendor at our last port. I talked 4 hours as I sat there. I told Benjamin and Nathan about my life, my studies, and my aspirations to become a marine biologist in front of the empty pool. I assured them that I would ensure their narrative was heard, and that hush money and legal threats would not be used to cover up their deaths. That evening, the noise ceased, and never returning in the weeks I had left on the Heavenly Explorer. At last, the pool and I were at peace. After a difficult year, I booked the cruise as a means to start over. My sister had recently relocated across the nation. I was in between jobs, and everything seemed to be stuck. I was persuaded by a buddy that a week at sea may help me decompress. I therefore took advantage of a discount on a mid-sized cruise line that sailed from Galveston. The ship was a mid-tier choice rather than a giant. The ostentatious type, complete with zip lines and water slides, but with the standard facilities: a dining area, a casino, a pool deck, and bars strewn across the decks. I went alone with the idea that I would read, write in my diary, and perhaps talk to some strangers. I was surprised to receive encased in something strange. This is definitely not the case. I had settled into a pleasant little routine on the second day. Mornings were spent sipping coffee and exploring the top decks, while afternoons were spent by the couch at the stern, and evenings by the pool. Soft jazz, dim lighting, and Ellis, a surprisingly good bartender. It appeared that everyone knew him. He had the effortless charm that you observe in those who have worked there 4 years. Silky, but never phony. After one order, you always remember your drink and are good with names. He would make jokes, inquire about your day, and provide brief praise in the most unexpected moment. Someone who gave you the impression that you were right where you should be. I began to go there more frequently because of the environment, as well as the drinks. It was comfortable and removed from the throng. There weren't many of us at the bar one evening. I was traveling with an older man and his adult daughter, along with a couple from Vermont. We spent a significant amount of time talking, and I recall Ellis giggling at one of my ridiculous tales about a failed Tinder match. As he handed me the tab, he smirked and leaned in to say, "You'd be surprised how many disasters start with good cocktails." As usual, I used my card to make the purchase, without even looking at it before putting it back in my wallet. Things didn't start to seem odd until 2 days later. My bank had sent me a notification when we were anchored in Bees, something about a Miami boutique fee. It had been months since I had visited the Miami area. I initially dismissed it, thinking it was a bug or perhaps a reoccurring issue that I had overlooked. Then another charge appeared, though this time it's an Orlando gas station. The tension began to build at that point. I used the program to lock my card right away, but as I was doing so, I kept playing back my previous shipboard purchases. That lounge bar was the only place I had used the card, and only with Ellis. I initially remained silent back on the ship. Without evidence, I didn't want to start making accusations. I still harbored the hope that it was a coincidence. Before I even boarded, my card might have been skimmed. However, I also heard a couple at the next table think about strange expenditures on their credit card later that evening during supper. They claimed to have only used it once at the ship's bar, and were attempting to determine how they had been hit. I softly stepped in to inquire which one it was. I felt as though a silent alarm went off in my head when they mentioned the one near the jazz lounge in the back. Same bartender, same location. I went to guest services the following morning to report it. The woman at the counter didn't even blink, which surprised me because I half expected them to dismiss me or blame some overseas vendor. She made some inquiries: which bar, on what day, who was at work, and then excused herself to speak with someone behind a door that was covered in ice. Her tone had changed by the time she returned. She thanked me and mentioned that my information was useful and that they had already been looking at some of the problems. It dawned on me then that this was not a singular incident. It wasn't just me. It wasn't even brand new. Word began to travel more quickly than anyone could stop it. On board rumors are difficult to ignore, much like smoke in a closed environment. All of a sudden, people began muttering names and buzzing in corners as they took out their phones to check their banks. Ellis's name was repeated to me. According to a woman from Deck 6, her husband was spotted handling their card while holding his phone for an extended period of time. Ellis always turned slightly away when swiping, as if obstructing the view, according to another person, but nobody wanted to believe it. He was too normal, too nice. However, you stop acting as though they are random when too many dots begin to connect. They shut down the bar that evening, just a sign that read temporarily unavailable with no explanation. People were tense, and Ellis was nowhere to be seen. Everyone sensed something had gone down, even if the ship made no formal announcements. Outside the staff corridor, close to the lower decks, I heard two officers conversing softly. A tablet was clutched by one of them. I swear it looked like stills from a security camera, but I was only able to get a glance. Red rings are painted around a person's phone-holding hand, next to a credit card terminal in screenshots that are stopped in mid-motion. There was an odd tension that pervaded the remainder of the journey. They were courteous but cautious. Talk seemed to be shorter. I stayed on the crew longer. Ellis never appeared in my life again. Furthermore, nobody would openly discuss what had happened to him. But in the silence, there were rumors. According to one story, he had been discreetly taken to the next port. Another said that after seeing the security tape, he had admitted to everything. According to someone, his phone included dozens of pictures, cards, names, numbers, and expiration dates up close. The trust was lost. Regardless of the truth, I kept mentally reliving our exchanges. He grinned all those times, his easygoing manner, his quips, and the times when you thought he genuinely cared. I was moved by that. The theft wasn't the only thing. It was the manner in which he gave you a sense of security. There were levels to the deception. The acidic flavor lingered long after I disembarked from the ship, because it was almost lovely. He was more than just a money thief. He employed trust as a tactic. The cruise line sent a vague email of apologies after I returned to the mainland, thanking passengers for their cooperation and promising that the issue had been rectified in compliance with legal and marine norms. The bogus charges were easily repaid by my bank, but I never received a clear response regarding the number of individuals impacted. Some estimated over 100, while others stated dozens. We'll never know the exact amount. In my opinion, he had likely been doing it for several months, if not longer. Perhaps he wasn't alone at all. I still don't use my card at bars, especially while I'm on a cruise. I also keep one eye on the charmer, and the other on their hands if someone is getting too friendly too quickly. Sometimes I still think about the journey. The gnawing knowledge that the guy pouring your drink might be pocketing something else totally is more important than the beaches or sunsets. Worst of all, you most likely thanked him for it. I'm here at 2 a.m, wide awake, and the events of that cruise last month are still on my mind. Maybe writing it down will help me process things because I can't stop thinking about it. I'm a 34-year-old Phoenix accountant, and to be honest, finding a good parking space at the mall is frequently the most exciting thing that occurs in my life. Jessica, my wife, had been pleading me to go on vacation for months, claiming that I was prepared to burn out entirely. She was not mistaken. During tax season, I had been working 12-hour days for 3 months in a row. I thought, why not? When she came across this 7-day Caribbean cruise offer online. November was the month. It's the ideal time to relax and get away from the heat at home. One of those enormous floating cities with restaurants, swimming pools, and enough entertainment to keep hundreds of people occupied. The ship was named the Royal Horizon. Jessica was ecstatic. Before we even got on the plane, she had already arranged our whole schedule. I needed the first 3 days more than anything else. For the first time in months, I was able to put spreadsheets and client deadlines out of my mind. We overindulged at the buffet. I even gave the rock climbing wall a go when Jessica pulled me to the dance courses. The weather was great. I had never seen the water in such a stunning hue of blue. I also felt like I could breathe for the first time. Every evening, we would sit on the small balcony of our cabin, which was on deck 8, starboard side, and watch the sunset. The crew was amiable, often grinning and inquiring if we needed anything. I recall thinking that perhaps Jessica was correct because everything was proceeding according to plan. Perhaps I should take more time off from work after all. This was on board the ship, pattern to everything. Meals at the same times, activities, planned minute by minute, and the soft rocking motion that allowed me to sleep better than I had in years. Everything was this cozy predictability that made everything feel safe and ordered. Things began to go strange on Wednesday morning. I woke up at around 6 in the morning, because I started going out on the deck before the masses showed up. The early wake-up call was always worth it for the dawn over the water. I heard voices coming from below as I was doing my routine round around deck 7. Amidst the often upbeat crew conversation, there were hushed, angry whispers. I could see at least 4 people arguing in what sounded like a row as I leaned against the railing, Spanish and English mixed together. Another voice, unmistakably American, was saying something about keeping things quiet until we docked. One voice repeatedly said no pasa, which I understood from my high school Spanish to mean it can't be. I paused at the urgency in their voices. These were not the same crew members who had been preparing towel animals and handing us drinks. For the previous 3 days, the tension in these utterances was like a dagger piercing the still morning air. The sound of footsteps, many of them swiftly moving over the metal flooring below, was what truly drew my attention. I heard big objects being hauled, machinery being moved, and what sounded like smashing or hammering. I realized this wasn't routine maintenance work when the roar reverberated up through the ship's structure. I had spent enough time aboard the ship to recognize the typical noises: the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the soft whoosh of the air conditioner, and the soft hum of the engines. This was not like the others. There was serious, almost frenzied activity taking place in areas of the ship that were off limits. To passengers, I discovered that I couldn't see anything from where I was standing when I attempted to look down to see what was going on. Suddenly, as if someone had noticed me up there, the voices ceased. The cacophony had been disturbing, but the abrupt silence was more so. After a few minutes of waiting, I could no longer hear the activity, which seemed to have moved farther into the ship. I told Jessica what I had heard at breakfast, but she dismissed it with a laugh, stating that they were most likely performing standard upkeep or getting ready for a surprise event. Her positive outlook was contagious, and I nearly believed she was correct. That is, until we were eating and I saw something strange. 3 crew members, I had never seen them strolling around the dining area, observing people instead of clearing tables or serving food. Their name badges were distinctive, but they wore the same uniforms as the rest of the crew, instead of the typical upbeat names like Cruise Director, Antonio, or these just stated personnel in main black letters, Maria Guest Services. They made deliberate movements, looking at faces and making notes on tiny clipboards. A tall man with a tattoo on his neck that protruded from his collar was one of them, and he continued to stare at our table for longer than necessary cozy. Unlike the other crew members, he did not grin or nod when I looked him in the eye. His boss patted his shoulder and gestured him to another area of the dining room, but he continued to stare. Jessica getting up to get more coffee from the buffet was the most bizarre aspect. The man with the neck tattoo approached her right away and appeared to be examining her plate, napkin, and even the chair she had been occupying. Although he was being tactful and feigning to clean the table next to ours, I could see he was researching every aspect of our location. Jessica was talking to an elderly traveler, Helen from Michigan, who was traveling with her sister. When she returned, Helen was chatting quickly because she was enthused about something. Regarding her observations of crewmen engaging in an enigmatic activity on Deck 3 earlier that morning. She claimed that only specific crew members were being allowed to pass through a part that had been completely closed off with yellow tape. Although Margaret, Helen's sister, rolled her eyes and claimed that Helen watched too many crime shows, I could tell that Helen was sincere, disturbed by what she had witnessed. My gut clenched with a sense of fear I hadn't experienced since I was a child, knowing that someone else had observed strange activities. The atmosphere aboard the ship had changed entirely by Thursday afternoon. Passengers began to hear rumors that something was happening on the lower decks. Individuals were congregating in tiny groups, whispering in the corridors, and exchanging theories about what they had heard or seen. The way the personnel behaved had also altered. Even though they were still courteous, there was a tension that pervaded every exchange. Paulo, our room attendant, went white when I questioned him about the sections that were sealed off. He claimed that management had instructed them not to speak to guests about operational issues. I realized this wasn't just standard maintenance, because he was truly afraid. A warning regarding increased security procedures was included to the ship's daily newsletter, which typically offered positive updates about events and weather. Passengers were also requested to report any suspicious observations to guest services. Right away, everyone was monitoring everyone other in this paranoid environment because they were urging passengers to basically spy on one another. The fact that we were scheduled to dock at Casamel the following morning, yet an announcement was made that afternoon stating our port schedule issues would cause an arrival delay of several hours. The intercom voice of the captain sounded so artificially happy that it was completely out of place. He kept telling us to make the most of the ship's facilities and enjoy the extra time at sea. However, you could hear the tension in his speech. While Jessica and I were eating supper that night, we observed a number of guests squabbling with the guest services representatives. That afternoon, a couple demanded to know why their friend's cabin had been examined. Additionally, a different family was concerned that their teenage son had been asked where he had gone in the morning. The employees repeatedly expressed regret and claimed that it was all a part of routine security protocols, but their justifications were insufficient and ambiguous. Days before, the dining room had been a hive of chatter and laughing, but now it felt uncomfortable and muted. Instead of staying for dessert and drinks, as they had in the past, many were eating fast and heading off. The moment when everything became completely evident occurred on Friday morning. When I went to the deck after waking up early once more, I noticed something that made my heart race. Even in the sunshine, the lights of 3 Coast Guard ships were flashing as they approached our ship. Within an hour, officers in uniform started on board, and the captain's announcement eliminated all appearance of normalcy. He said that government officials were carrying out a standard examination, and that all travelers should maintain composure and provide their full cooperation. No one was duped by the word routine. A simple inspection doesn't require 3 Coast Guard cutters. Jessica took hold of my arm so firmly that I believed she might cause bruises, and I could see the same terror in her eyes that I did. The officers dispersed systematically across the ship. In a matter of minutes, they were rapping on cabin doors, verifying identity, and inquiring about the guests' prior few days' activities. The officer was thorough yet professional when they arrived in our cabin, asking us specific questions about our whereabouts, our observations, and whether we had observed any odd behavior from the passengers or crew. When we were instructed to assemble in the main auditorium for a required briefing, it was the biggest shock. They have received credible intelligence about illegal smuggling activities on board our ship, explained the lead investigator, a tough lady in her 50s. She stated that the inquiry would go on until the guilty persons were identified, since they had proof that a member of the crew or passengers had engaged in the transportation of illicit goods. She made it clear that, though everyone would be questioned and some parts of the ship would be off limits until further notice, innocent individuals had nothing to fear, except for the occasional anxious cough and the sound of individuals shifting in their chairs. The room was completely quiet. Observing the faces of my fellow travelers, I noticed the similar mix of the shock and astonishment I was experiencing. This was not intended to occur while on vacation. This was not something you experienced while attempting to unwind and forget about your troubles back home. Rather, it was the sort of thing you read about in the news. The hours that followed were awaiting an uncertain nightmare. In conference rooms that had been converted into temporary interrogation rooms, they separated us into groups and interrogated each of us individually. The officer questioned me about everything when it was my turn. The odd crew members I'd seen, the voices I'd heard Wednesday morning, and even Helen's explanation of the restricted sections. Even though I was only attempting to assist, I felt like I was betraying people by telling them everything I could recall. My description of the crew member with the neck tattoo piqued the officer's curiosity, and he made thorough notes. They let me return to the main areas after what seemed like hours of the ship, but suddenly the air was entirely different. People were acting as though everyone else may be a suspect, avoiding eye contact and muttering in corners. Officers used canines and specialized equipment to search cargo facilities, crew quarters, and even passenger bags as part of the inquiry, which lasted another full day. Apparatus, they finally made an arrest on Saturday night. It wasn't even a passenger. The man with the neck tattoo, who had been observing our table, was one of 3 crew members. They were allegedly transporting cocaine between ports by disguising the packages in legal shipments and recovering them during port pauses in the ship's cargo holds. After learning that authorities were aware of them, they had been attempting to relocate their operation to the blocked-off sites Helen had seen. The voices that I had heard, they argued Wednesday morning over whether to try to get everything off the ship at the next port or to dump it all overboard. According to the inquiry, the smugglers had been utilizing their positions to coordinate with individuals at several ports and get access to prohibited areas for months. After the 3 crew members were removed gradually, the environment of the ship gradually stabilized, but the harm was already done. We all seemed to be going through the motions until we could get home and attempt to forget what had happened. So the remainder of the voyage felt meaningless. Months later, I continued to reflect on how a straightforward vacation evolved into something that caused me to reevaluate all of my preconceived notions about trust and safety. Music I had been saving for that cruise for more than a year. Something calmer, more laid back, not one of those crazy party ships. It was primarily a mid-range line, a few lone tourists like me, as well as families and elderly couples. This was meant to be my much-needed break from teaching history in a middle school in New Hampshire. The initial days were pleasant, with a quiet sea, good meals, and a gregarious elderly couple. They made me think of my aunt and uncle at the dinner table. The ship then veered off course on the 4th morning. Word got out that someone had fallen close to the pool deck, but no notification was made at first. They hurried a stretcher beyond the buffet. Seizures and strokes were whispered. Finally, at midday, the captain announced over the speakers that we would be making a quick, unforeseen stop to bring the passenger medical assistance. At a port I'd docked never known of, it appeared to be a supply station other than a true stop, was a single, long, narrow pier that led to a few dilapidated dwellings. There were no vibrant marketplaces or signs, or tour guides, like at the other ports, only heavy, muggy air and an unusually strong sun. At about 2 p.m., the crew announced something, stating that while the medical transfer was taking place, we may spend a few hours on shore, as long as we didn't outside the approved region. While the majority didn't care, some of us were intrigued and stir-crazy. I left with a small group of people, primarily elderly people, 2 teens, and Brandon, a guy I had spoken to earlier in the week. Wearing cargo shorts and an Arizona Cardinals hat, he appeared to be in his early 30s. He was reserved yet genuine in his friendliness. We strolled around the harbor district, which had the strange desolation of a location that wasn't anticipating visitors. One building contained a small bar, and another had a woman selling gum and bottled water from a cooler. There's no music, only a dusty fan circling slowly overhead. Brandon and I spent some time sitting on a bench close to the dock's edge. He joked that he wasn't sure if ocean air was making him feel better or worse after talking about how he was flying alone following a split. Around 400 p.m., a crew member began using a bullhorn to summon people back. Thus, we all crept in the direction of the gang path. Brandon is well in my memory. He was nodding in agreement with one of the adolescents as he walked in front of me. He was the first person to board the ship, before I could no longer see him amid the mob. We even briefly waved. It was an odd dinner that evening. Martin and Evelyn, the pair at my table, kept looking at an empty chair close to them. Martin added, leaning in my direction, "Brandon was meant to sit here. Give it much thought. On cruise ships, people frequently miss dinners. He might have been eating at the buffet or exhausted. However, the ship was bustling by sunrise. The door of his stateroom was reportedly left open. According to another, a steward had entered and discovered it was empty. Nothing, no bag, no clothes. Then, right before lunch, a woman by the atrium began to speak louder. She claimed to have witnessed Brandon return to the ship. In addition, 3 people immediately agreed with her. When questioned about it, the crew denied he ever reboarded, despite describing the same grey backpack and red hat. By the afternoon, the atmosphere aboard had changed from light-hearted worrying to subdued anxiety, with statements like "we're looking into it." Crew members sidestepped direct inquiries concerning Brandon. "Or we've got protocols in place." Evelyn, who had been strangely protective of Brandon despite their limited acquaintance, began to inquire. The on-duty officer pretended to be perplexed when she told me that she had gone to the front desk and wanted to speak with security, claimed that the passenger list did not contain anyone with that name. It became odd at that point. I had no doubt that Brandon existed. I had talked to him and sat next to him. I had witnessed him re-entering the ship. But when I looked at the daily itinerary from the beginning of the vacation, none of the events we had both attended had his name on it. He appeared to have been cleaned out of curiosity. I even returned to the tavern we had visited on land. Before we got back on the plane, I had snapped a brief picture in front of it. Brandon was not there when I zoomed in, but I could see a few other folks in the background. I took another look at my phone's gallery. Nothing. I remembered snapping a photo with him sitting next to me, but there was not a single picture of him. He began to play with my mind in that empty spot where he should have been. Evelyn claimed to have seen him on the first day of the lifeboat training. He lent him a charger, according to a teen group member. However, currently those who had only spoken to him 2 days prior were suddenly uncertain. One woman replied, "Maybe I'm mixing him up with someone else," in a somewhat shaky voice. I wandered the upper deck late that night in an attempt to decompress. The ship was silent. Approximately 1:30 a.m. I heard something as I went by one of the crew-only doors by the back stairs. On the opposite side are slow, deliberate footsteps. I paused and waited. After a while, the steps came to a sudden halt. I took a step back and descended a level. Something was stuck beneath one of the ornamental plants as I passed the tiny library area, a badge that has been laminated. I picked it up even though it wasn't mine. I suppose it's instinct. It only contained Brandon's first name, room number, and no picture. I glanced toward the corridor. I was standing 2 doors down from his room. I paused, then went because I had to see it for myself. The door was broken. It was resting there, not open or closed, as if someone had forgotten to fully close it. I gave it a light push. Even though the lights were out, the hallway's illumination was sufficient to identify the shapes inside. The bed was made just so. There were no suitcases, toiletries, bedside items, or even a keycard. There is only one thing in the middle of the pillow. One of those folded napkins they offer you at the pool with your drinks. Half anticipating some stupid joke or sketch, I moved forward and grabbed it, but it was just 2 words scrawled in crooked handwriting, "Don't follow." I spent far too much time standing there with a napkin in hand, attempting to figure out if this was a sophisticated practical joke or something far more serious. The napkin was gone the following morning. I am aware that sounds as I had envisioned, but I kept it folded in my cabin drawer beneath my journal. The drawer remained undamaged when I opened it, but the napkin was gone. I kept the staff in the dark. I was already aware of what the response would be. At breakfast, Evelyn and I had our final conversation. It appeared as though she had not slept at all. Leaning closer, she asked me softly. I hadn't given it any thought until that point. "Did he ever tell you his last name?" It was something I couldn't recall him saying. Even the child, who claimed to have borrowed his phone charger, was unable to do so. For us both, that's when it clicked. Brandon's identity remained a mystery to all of us. I called the cruise line's customer service from the airport after we disembarked. I didn't circle back. I provided them with his room number, first name, description, and the fact that he had vanished. After putting me on hold for a bit, the woman on the line returned with a solid, practiced voice. "I apologize, sir, but that name was never used to register a visitor on that sailing." I pushed back and inquired as to whether someone had snuck on or whether a staff member had utilized that room. According to her, internal logs verified that the room had been vacant for the duration of the cruise. I inquired as to whether incident reports had been sent to them. She said it again. I felt as though I had slipped out of reality as I hung up. The night following, I didn't get much sleep. I couldn't get the folded napkin out of my head. I received a message from Evelyn on one of those cruise community boards a few weeks later. Something odd had been discovered by her, a 3-year-old passenger list from a different ship, her same fleet. A Brandon C. was listed. We met a man in his early 30s who lived in the same state. He had vanished while on a seaside excursion. His remains were never found. The thread she discovered stated that he was last seen returning to the ship, but it was unclear whether he had reached his accommodation. I was completely stopped by that. It took me 3 readings to fully comprehend the post, name, age, and the gratifying detail. It couldn't be a coincidence because it was too exact. Nevertheless, nobody ever discussed that occurrence in public. No remark or news from the cruise line. I'm still unsure as to whether Brandon was real or if we were meant to meet someone or anything else, but what I observed is known to me. I am aware that we spoke. I recall the silent cardinal's hat, the voice, the way he seemed unsure about returning while gazing out over the ocean. Since then, I've maintained a land vacation. I don't discuss this with others unless I'm certain they'll believe me. Evelyn and I continue to check in occasionally. She occasionally gives me a screenshot of a post made by a cruise group that references a quiet man wearing a red hat who disappeared in the middle of the journey. Additionally, the first name is consistently the same.